a quiet evening, a flower show, and a simple announcement. Everything was perfectly normal, but suddenly a voice through the loudspeaker shook the entire town of Flaxborough. It was the voice of Dr. Harcote, a man who had been buried only a few days earlier. What do you think? Was this truly a voice from the grave, or someone's clever trick? And tell me, where are you listening from right now, sitting in your living room, lying on your hostel bed, or maybe traveling on a bus? What time is it on the clock where you are? All right then, let's not keep you waiting any longer. Let's begin this mystery. The memorial hall had a smell that the town found reassuring, a permanent compromise between furniture polish and boiled cabbage. On Saturdays, it added its public virtue to whatever the committee required of it: bring-and-buys, blood drives, moral improvement, and on this particular morning, it was lending dignity to the Flaxborough Horticultural and Domestic Produce Society's summer show. The bunting was more conscientious than festive. Ranks of marrows sat with the grave self-importance of municipal councillors. Poultice-coloured cakes, all of them believed by their authors to have come out a bit over, had been formed into a landscape of gentle domes. The carnations were fragrant, and the judges had the serene despair out of those who knew any decision would prove that the Almighty had not been properly consulted. Miss Cora Vine, who took the information desk as if it were a pulpit and her duty evangelical, smoothed the visitor's book with a motion like settling a child's collar. She had erected beside her a hand-lettered notice. Announcements by loudspeaker at the top of the hour. It never had been at the top of the hour, but Miss Vine had learned that a promise of punctuality was more soothing than its observance. At 5 minutes to 11, she nodded to the boy from Barker's Electrical, who had brought a tangle of cables and a black microphone the size of an orange. He produced, not without pride, a small cardboard device to be used with a dial telephone, the telephone speech link, his employer's invention, and, he hinted, just the thing for modern organizations not yet ready for modernity. "We ring the mayor," Miss Vine explained to the committee steward, who nodded as if addressing the mayor by telephone were very nearly treason. "He has recorded a greeting. It will—" She lifted a hand, indicating that the air would shortly be full of civic benevolence. "Play for all." The boy, who had the expression of those who must be called lad in perpetuity, set the coupler over the telephone's mouthpiece, pressed a red button, and stepped back. Miss Vine dialed the number the town clerk's office had written on a beige index card. The hall, sensing performance, hushed. Only the carnations went on living their secret lives. After a light shower of clicks, the line hummed. Miss Vine smiled at the expectant faces and lifted the microphone, ready to say, "Your worship, we have you," in a tone that would flatter a deity. The hum lengthened into silence. Then, clear and unhurried, came a man's voice, "Harcote speaking." It was not the mayor's voice, which was known to be potato-shaped and cautious. This one was clipped, cool, and with a coaxing patience best reserved for the sick and the fussy. It had a mannered at the end that several in the hall recognized without wanting to. Someone, perhaps Mrs. Clegg, whose husband had been advised by that very voice to give up pickled onions, made a little sound like a chair leg dragged across stone. Miss Vine's smile remained exactly where she had put it, and in the space behind it, a thought sounded very much like a prayer that technology might kindly keep to its place. "Your worship," she said into the microphone, as if a prompt might persuade the universe that it had dialed correctly. "Harcote here," the voice repeated. "Do go on." The remark did not help. Dr. Lionel Harcote, late of Queen Street Surgery, had been buried the previous Thursday in the municipal cemetery, under a stone modest enough to satisfy both his atheism and his widow. The town, which had not always liked him, had been careful to remember that it had always admired him. There was, on several mantels, a temporarily elevated inhaler. Reverend Lister, who had come to bless the marmalade, did not so much cross himself as make a movement that would satisfy any bystander who required a clergyman to be equal to sudden theological demand. He glanced at Mrs. Harcote's friend, a slim woman in a jacket like contrition. The friend closed her eyes in that way peculiar to those who have been obliged to visit Queen Street many times and did not propose to visit it again. "Say something," hissed the steward. Miss Vine, who believed human speech could cure machinery, leaned closer. "Dr. Harcote," she murmured, very gently. "Is the mayor with you?" There was a pause, as one might allow a fool to reconsider. Then the voice, with an almost amiable impatience. "Miss Dean, take the name, if you please." The hall, which had not expected to be cast, held its breath. Miss Felicity Dean had been Harcote's receptionist, his shield and, several thought, the reason the surgery had ever seemed human. She was not present, but the name, thrown into the air, hung there like a handkerchief on nothing. The boy from Barker's, seeing an opportunity to be necessary, turned a knob. The sound rose like a ghost being asked to speak up. "And put him down for Tuesday at 10:30. The voice continued, now with the briskness of a dictated mercy. "No, not Stokes. Stokes is the one with the nephew. The other man has a dog that sneezes." The hall achieved a collective recoil without anyone moving. People became intensely interested in their plates and blooms. It was the English way of fainting in company. Miss Vine cut the line with a movement that was almost a blessing. The loudspeaker gave a last mild protest, a small crackle, as if the dead, too, disliked being interrupted in front of others. The boy from Barker's cleared his throat. "Must have crossed," he said, as if two wires had enjoyed an illicit moment. "Could happen anywhere." "Not everywhere," said Mrs. Clegg faintly. "Has a cemetery." The vicar, who distrusted coincidence on theological grounds, had already positioned himself to step into any conversational breach. "An exchange fault," he said. "We mustn't be fanciful. The mayor will call again." He added, as if to assure God that the town was behaving, "We shall carry on." But the hall's attention had been cut and rewoven into something else, that active quiet when people recognize one another's fear and are polite to it. Councillor Dora Dibb, whose view of the town was that it needed more order and fewer opinions, glided to Miss Vine with the severity of a head mistress. "Don't," she said, "dial anything. Don't even look at it. We shall announce by hand." "Will you write it out?" Miss Vine asked, grateful for labor. "Better," said Dora. "We shall whisper." By noon the whispering had enlarged and developed. The mayor's greeting, when at last it found its way through, was received dutifully and at a volume that suggested contrition, but the town's appetite had moved on. Those who had been present adopted that gravely helpful tone with which witnesses always confirm one another. Those who had not been present found that they remembered exactly what they would have heard, if only they had been. At the station buffet, where incidents came to be folded and put away with railway paper napkins, the girl behind the counter told the porter that she had been there. She hadn't. And that the voice had said, "Don't keep me waiting, Miss Dean." It hadn't. The porter said that Dr. Harcote had once told him to stop smoking because his cough made the waiting room sound like a Victorian orphanage. He had. The buffet agreed that the dead, like the trains, were apt to keep their timetables. In the snug of the Peacock and Teasel, the town's small republic of retired men occupied itself with arranging theories in social order. Mr. Mallaby, who had been a postman and thus held perhaps 27 secrets for each street he had served, proposed that they could do anything now with tape recorders. Mr. Mallaby held they to be a combined conspiracy of youth and public bodies. Mr. Reps, who freelanced for the Flaxborough Citizen at rates that reflected the paper's conviction that events ought to remain cheap, wrote the word séance in his notebook, then crossed it out so that if asked, he could deny it. By mid-afternoon, no one could say whether the town had been frightened or amused. It had, very sensibly, been both. Fear made the gossip acceptable, and amusement made it bearable. At Queen Street, the surgery door was shut, and the little brass plate, Dr. Lionel Harcote, had been unscrewed as if the building were being prepared for resale at an auction where such things mattered. Inside, in the waiting room where the chairs were all a little too honest, Mrs. Elspeth Harcote stood with her gloves in her hand and a patience that looked, to those who did not know her, like gentleness. "It will come to nothing," she said to Miss Dean, who was pale only around the mouth. A trick of the line. Lionel never did learn to keep his voice where he put it. Miss Dean nodded because there was nothing to do that looked better. "People will talk, Mrs. Harcote." "Of course," said Mrs. Harcote. "It is their circulation." She did not add that her husband, whose bedside manner had been a kind of controlled impatience, had brothers and friends and enemies who could have imitated him too well for comfort. She did not add that there were papers in the bureau that had lately looked at her as if they might one day be evidence. Widowhood requires the economy of the inner life. In the late afternoon, when the Memorial Hall had recovered its smell and the boy from Barker's had gone home taking his device with him, a telephone rang in an office that belonged to a police station built by men who understood brick and thrift. The call was answered in a tone that suggested that nothing could surprise but everything might be obliged to. Flaxborough Police Station. "It's Dora Dibb," said the voice, crisp with the civic right to be heard. "I imagine," she added, "that you've already been told. But in case the town has decided to keep it to itself for purposes of drama, do know that your dead doctor has been taking calls." There was the businesslike pause of a pencil being aligned with a page. "Thank you, counsellor," said a mild voice. "We have heard some, versions. Could you oblige me with your own?" "Certainly," Dora said. "We were to have the mayor on the loudspeaker. Instead we had Dr. Harcote. He spoke as if he were at work. He asked Miss Dean to take a name. What you decide to call that is your affair. I shall call it improper." "Much obliged." The voice made a small domestic sound, like a page turned back. "We'll make some inquiries." The mild voice belonged to Inspector Purbright, who had heard stranger things said with less certainty. He replaced the receiver with a care that might have been mistaken for boredom, and sat for a moment in the company of his desk in the late afternoon light, thinking about the town's appetite for the civilized supernatural. There were very few ghosts in Flaxborough, and all of them paid their rates. He considered, too, the convenience of a dead man being available to reassure the living. The living were so often inconvenient. Sergeant Love came in with the monthly returns, which did not require thought, and therefore had a dangerous capacity to encourage it. "They say the doctor spoke," he said, which was the town's formula for moving hearsay to the minutes. "I dare say he did at one time," said Purbright. "The question is—" He stopped. He disliked questions that arrived before tea, as they tended to bring friends. "Yes, sir." Why he chose the Memorial Hall, and whose convenience was thereby served. Love waited. He had learned that when Purbright withheld comment, it wasn't the information that was absent, but the point of charitable delivery. Love's job, as he saw it, was to carry boxes. "I think we shall begin," said Purbright, "by letting people talk. Then, when the story has become odd enough to be admitted as merely true, we will ask the thing that nobody wants to be asked." "What is that, sir?" Purbright's eyes went to the window, where a fly made a noise like a small idea. "Who, precisely," he said, "benefits from answering in the voice of a man who cannot be contradicted?" He stood, found his hat, and reached for the case file whose label had not yet been written. "Come along, we will go and admire the marrows." "There is nothing," he added with a thin smile, "like a vegetable to put men's motives in order." Inspector Purbright's appreciation of vegetables had been acquired professionally. Their presence in numbers guaranteed privacy, because people in charge of them disliked disturbance. Their owners were happily convinced that the squad car had come to admire the marrow and not to ask about motives. He and Sergeant Love were received at the Memorial Hall door by the warm odor of wilted bunting and a draught that had among its virtues the steadying of flags. Miss Vine, still posted at her lectern like a tasteful gargoyle, placed her palm over the visitor's book as though to preserve the innocence of those who had signed. "Inspector," she said, the title administered like a sedative. "If you have come to confiscate anything, might I recommend the rock cakes? They are a danger to shipping." Purbright allowed the corners of his mouth to perform their light exercise. "We came to admire civic industry," he said, "and to ask, very quietly, whether we might look at the telephone and whatever contrivance united it to the concept of a mayoral greeting." She gestured to the table at the side wall where the boy from Barker's had arranged his equipment earlier with the reverence of a magician setting out a deck. The apparatus had been removed, but there remained, like the print of a body after it has risen, the loop of cable, a cardboard sleeve-stamped telephone speech link, Barker's of Northgate, and a beige index card propped against a jar of chutney whose label promised an experience with plums. There was also the whole telephone itself, a sturdy black instrument with a dial as clean as if the numbers were still shy of being chosen. "We returned the device," Miss Vine said. "The boy, whose name is Trevor, or possibly Kevin, declared that the defect resided in the nation's infrastructure, which we ought to forgive because the boy's employer is saving it. He left that card because it looked authoritative." Love picked up the sleeve and turned it in his hands as though it might confess. "Neat thing," he observed. "What did you dial, Miss Vine?" "The town clerk's office," she said. "There is the number. I've had it in my book since the days when they believed one might be indiscreet about water rates. You will see." She took the card and held it like a tag attached to virtue. "It is written by Mr. Sprott's secretary." She forms her fours with a Presbyterian sternness. Purbright examined the figures. They were indeed the kind that never relaxed. One digit, the third, had been written over itself, neatly, with the exactness of someone determined that error should look like intention. He held the card a moment longer than necessary, and set it back where it had been, so that if it had become a clue, it could remain decorous about it. "Who was near you when you dialed?" he asked. Miss Vine's eyes took a brief stroll round the room, selecting people as a hostess might select comparisons for a talk. "The vicar," she said. "Mrs. Clegg. Councillor Dibb, of course. The boy with the apparatus. Those three judges who never admit defeat. They were making a point about the difference between firmness and mastication. No one else close. The microphone cable, you understand, was longer than truth. And when the voice came?" She lifted her chin. It was the movement of a woman who has decided to be absolutely reliable and might be persuaded to forgive the world if it only promised not to do it again. It was Dr. Harcote. The tone, the unkind patience, the way he held a silence as you might hold a door to see who goes through. He asked for Miss Dean to take a name. He corrected himself about Stokes, and said something about a dog that sneezes. She put her hand flat on the table. He did not sound amused. "He rarely did," Love put in. "I had a wart. He spoke as if it were a national embarrassment." Purbright looked thoughtfully at the telephone. "Did anyone," he asked, "touch the instrument after you?" "Only my better nature," Miss Vine said. The boy made a motion to adjust the coupler, but I believe it was I who cut the line. Councillor Dibb was already composing an instruction to the town in her head. She prefers to speak in emergencies because it saves paper. The vicar, summoned by that invisible social bell that rings whenever there is an official within reach, approached with hands that made a small chapel out of themselves. He was a man who, confronted by the supernatural, would first suggest a committee. "Inspector," he said, "this is not a parish matter. I mention it only to reassure Miss Vine. Telephony is a mysterious thing. We must not confuse chance with intention." Purbright entertained himself briefly with the thought that human life consisted almost entirely of confusing those two. "Quite," he said. Would you be so kind as to tell me where you were standing when the voice spoke?" The clergyman pointed to a spot near the telephone table. "Here," he said, "by the electrical buoy." I was impressed, I confess, that the device permitted such audibility. Dr. Harcote always could be heard, of course. He had a way of talking as if the air were already organized. "Did you notice anyone near the telephone earlier?" Purbright asked. The vicar tilted his head, like a man listening to a hymn written by a friend. Mrs. Harcote's acquaintance, tall, quiet, wore a jacket that looked as if it had promised not to attract attention. She came up when Miss Vine was rehearsing what she would say to the mayor. She did not touch anything. She stood as good people stand near misfortune. "Thank you," Purbright said, and wrote nothing down. He preferred his notes to be made later when the town had stopped watching. They found the boy from Barker's behind his counter on Northgate, where he was restringing the virtues of transistor radios with the care of a child plaiting grass. He brightened at sight of authority, either because it promised story or because it might buy something. "I've got a new batch of links coming in Tuesday," he said, indicating a depth of stock that the shop did not appear to possess in any dimension. "We're doing a special where the mayor can open your fate while sitting at home with his slippers on." Purbright asked how the thing worked, and the boy told him with a seriousness that suggested theology. You cradled the telephone's mouthpiece, attached the coupler with a little rubber cup, and sound went in and came out again amplified, as human speech does when it enters a committee and leaves as policy. "If the exchange is in a mood," he added, "you can get cross lines. Or if somebody's on a party line who shouldn't be. Though we don't like to say party," he amended, mindful of councillors. "Did you test the hall telephone before the display?" Purbright asked. "Rang the town clerk," the boy said. "Got engaged tone. Then it went through. Very clear. We had a minute or two of nothing, then the mayor said his bit. Later, when Miss Vine dialed at 11, it did that. Other thing. Anyone had access to the coupler while you were there?" "I wouldn't say access," said the boy, bristling technically. "It was on the table. I was right there. That councillor, Dibb, stood by it looking at it like it owed her money, and a lady in a jacket. She asked if the thing made copies." "Copies of what?" "Her question," he said loyally. "I told her it only makes things louder. She said that was often sufficient." "Did she give a name?" "Didn't offer one, and I had no right to ask." He said, revealing Northgate's etiquette. "She had a careful way about her, the sort that's come into money the hard way and kept the receipt." When they left, the boy called after them that he could put the station tannoy on the telephone for emergencies if desired. Love promised that if the nation fell, he would be first in. Queen Street Surgery had the air of a place that had been lightly dusted with silence. The brass plate had gone, but the dull rectangle where it had been remained, like a healed wound. Inside, the waiting room had its orderly chairs, and its notice advising that unwell people were likely to be seen before the merely curious. Miss Felicity Dean received them with the poise of someone who had stood before many emotions and decided not to join in. "We are not practicing," she said quietly, "but I can answer what I know. Mrs. Harcote will be in presently. She has a solicitor. It seems everything is to be counted." Purbright explained the purpose of his visit in a sentence that erred on the side of triviality. She sat, folded her hands professionally, and told him that, yes, doctor. Harcote would often dictate to her like that, from room to room, and that, yes, he had a habit of correcting his own instructions aloud because he mistrusted people who didn't hear him the first time. He would say, "Miss Dean," even if I was 3 feet away, she said. It kept the patients from joining in. "Do you recall," Purbright asked, "a Mr. Stokes with a nephew?" "Two Stokeses," she said without consulting anything. "Mr. Edwin Stokes, who came for his nerves and talked about his nephew's ambition for bicycles, and Mr. Neville Stokes, who had a nephew with adenoids and came for cough mixture because it was peaceable. The one with the nephew was—" her eyes did a small search among her memories. "Edwin. The other was not. "And who," said Purbright, "has a dog that sneezes?" She smiled a little, as one does when asked for a detail whose oddity confirms its accuracy. "Mr. Pym," she said. "He insists the animal's allergic to church bells. The dog is called Dandy. It is the only patient we have had who looked grateful for the prescription." So the phrase we heard this morning could have belonged to any day in the last 10 years. "It could," she agreed. "He reused his own sentences. He believed they had proven themselves." Mrs. Harcote arrived then, bringing with her a scent that was neither floral nor expensive, merely tidy. She greeted Purbright as if he had come to inspect the plumbing, and sat where she could see him without encouraging him. "I'm told," she said, "the town believes Lionel to be performing." He never could tolerate that. "We don't entertain the supernatural," Purbright said. "We investigate the practical. Did your husband ever have recordings of his consultations? Dictation machines?" "A small one," she said. "For letters too. Insurers and notes for articles he meant to write and never did. Miss Dean will tell you that he preferred his own voice on paper to anyone else's. The machine is in his desk. You may look." Miss Dean fetched it, a compact device with a cracked leather case, the sort of object designed to look grateful on an expense claim. Purbright examined it. The spool was half used, the tape marked with a paper label in a fine, thin hand. June. Prescriptions. Fees. He did not play it. He asked where the telephone line ran. Miss Dean showed him the little corridor where a cable clipped itself modestly along board and plaster into the cupboard that had contained supplies, and now contained nothing anyone wanted to think about. "Who has had keys since the funeral?" he asked. "Only me," said Miss Dean. "And Mrs. Harcote. The town hall has a set for inspection, but no one has called since Thursday. The chemist came to settle accounts and collect the prescription pads that hadn't been used. He was careful." "Do you know a woman," Purbright asked, "tall, quiet, who wears her restraint as if she had paid for it carefully? A friend of Mrs. Harcote?" Mrs. Harcote considered without change of expression. "Mrs. Gray," she said. "My cousin by marriage. She's kind without being interested. It is a useful combination. Why?" "She was near the telephone this morning," Purbright said mildly. "Nearness is free, but we like to tot it up." "I will tell her to stand further away," Mrs. Harcote said. "She will oblige." On the way back to the station, Love ventured that it could all be a cross line, some old recording left on somewhere between one wire and another. People said you could hear the ship to shore if the weather was wrong. Perhaps Queen Street has become coastal. "Perhaps," said Purbright. "I begin to like, however, that there are two Stokeses and only one that is the nephew Stokes. The human mind arranges itself conveniently for anyone who wishes to tamper." "Tamper with what?" "With the past," said Purbright. "It is the one thing people feel bold with. It can't answer back." In his office, he made notes finally, not because he needed them, but because paper is a way of persuading events to sit still. He wrote, "Voice authentic, phrases general but particular in habit, access at hall to telephone, boy protective, Miss Vine reliable, Counselor Dibb correct by temperament, Mrs. Harcote controlled, Miss Dean exact, Mrs. Gray present, two Stokeses. Pym's dog sneezes." He added a line he did not yet intend to explain to anyone. "Mayor's number altered and then unaltered." When Love came in with tea that had the color of institutional compromise, Purbright said, "We shall invite Miss Dean to come tomorrow morning and sit in our interview room with the dictation machine. We will play a portion of her own voice on it and see whether she hears anything she does not expect. People always reveal themselves when listening to themselves. And tonight, the Peacock and Teasel," Purbright said. "We will drink something aspirational and listen to the town. Somewhere between the marrows and the beer, there will be a small truth pretending to be a joke." Love paused at the door. Sir, if someone wanted the town to hear the doctor, why do it at the show? Because the show, Purbright said, is what passes here for a wireless set. You say a thing there and it broadcasts itself in decent language and with no need to shout. If one wished to lend authority to a message with no sender, one would choose a day when everyone is prepared to hear a voice and not ask from which direction it comes. Love nodded, respectful of the way in which Purbright arranged ordinary facts into a composition. What message, sir? That, said Purbright, standing to find his hat again, is the next small thing to be asked of somebody who isn't expecting it. The Peacock and Teasel had once been described in the Flaxborough Citizen as an inn of character, though it was generally agreed that the character in question belonged to whoever was speaking loudest at the bar. On the evening following the Memorial Hall's accidental séance, the Snug was abuzz with the kind of restrained excitement peculiar to English towns, one that expressed itself through silences carefully arranged between sentences. Inspector Purbright, accompanied by Sergeant Love, slipped in with the patience of men who understood that information often poured itself more freely into beer than into notebooks. The Snug was occupied by a semicircle of retired worthies whose ages, like their waistcoats, had settled into permanence. Mr. Mallaby, the former postman, held forth with a precision that suggested his old rounds were still being walked in his head. "Mark me," he said, tapping his empty glass as if it were a pulpit. The dead doctor's voice was a record. Them lads with their wirelesses and their taping machines could trick the Pope out of his grave if he had the manners to stay in one. His neighbor, Mr. Reps of the Citizen, gave a courteous cough. "Records," he said, "are most usually played on gramophones. What you are suggesting is more advanced. A tape, a spool. Magnetic." He added the last word with a tone of expertise, as though magnets were personally accountable to him. And if tape, then the question is, whose finger pressed the button? Love, trying not to look as if he were listening, observed Purbright's immovable serenity. The inspector's eyes remained on the scarred wooden table where condensation rings overlapped like geological strata. When Mallaby began to speculate that Mrs. Harcote herself had engineered the moment in order to remind the town of her late husband's importance, Purbright merely asked the barmaid for 2 milds. His quiet presence seemed to encourage the men to fill the silence with increasingly decorative gossip. "Didn't I say?" Mallaby insisted. The mayor's voice was meant to be what came through, so either the line played a trick or somebody thought it better if Harcote's voice did. And I tell you this, nothing spreads as well as a dead man talking. You can't contradict him and you can't forget him. "Except," said Reps with professional malice, "when you print a correction, which I won't." The talk turned to Miss Dean, the receptionist, who was praised for her unnecessary neatness and suspected in the same breath of knowing more about her employer than anyone ought. Love bristled in defense of the young woman, but Purbright placed a gentle hand on the table, a signal that listening was preferable to correcting. By the time they left, the inspector had been given, in confidence, 3 theories about ghosts, 2 about telephone operators with grudges, and 1 about scientific hoaxes, all of them mutually exclusive, but curiously united in their certainty. Love remarked, as they walked back toward the station, that the town seemed convinced something deliberate had been done, even if it could not agree by whom. "Indeed," Purbright said mildly. "When truth is inconvenient, people do not discard it. They embroider it until it resembles something they can put on the mantelpiece. Tomorrow, we shall ask who was sewing." The following morning, Miss Dean presented herself at the station at precisely 9:30. She was dressed in the restrained manner of someone who expected scrutiny, but refused to be embarrassed by it. In the interview room, she sat upright, hands folded, while Purbright placed the dictation machine on the table between them like a neutral witness. He wound the tape forward and pressed play. The room filled with Harcote's voice, brisk, faintly impatient, reciting a list of medicines for delivery, then pausing to correct a dosage. Miss Dean's composure did not shift, though her fingers tightened slightly as though they might steady the sound itself. "Is that how he would dictate to you?" Purbright asked. "Yes," she said. He preferred to say everything twice. Once for the tape, once for me. He believed duplication discouraged mistakes. It also discouraged conversation. Purbright let the tape run until it ended in the hiss of blankness. "Would anyone else have had access to this machine?" "No," she said, "except Mrs. Harcote, and she never touched it. She disliked his voice in the house." She hesitated, then added, "Though I will say, Mrs. Gray, the cousin, once asked about it. She said Lionel's tone would make a good lesson in how to be obeyed." "Did she handle the machine?" "Not then, but she watched me put it away." Love looked up from his notes. "Mrs. Gray was at the hall on Saturday," he said. "Near the telephone." Miss Dean nodded once, her lips compressed. "She is helpful, in a way that does not always ask permission." When she had gone, Purbright remained thoughtful. "There is a kind of person," he said, "who cannot resist arranging other people's memories. Mrs. Gray strikes me as one who might prefer her version of Lionel Harcote to be the one the town remembers. We mustn't assume, though, that preference is motive enough." They paid a call that afternoon on Mrs. Gray, who lived in a trim semi on the edge of town where the hedges had been clipped to an exactness that discouraged birds. She received them in a parlor that smelt faintly of lavender polish and compromise. Her manner was composed, even affable, though her eyes had the calculating patience of a woman accustomed to hearing confessions she had not asked for. "Yes, I was at the hall," she admitted with a little shrug. "Poor Cora Vine was in a flutter, and I thought I might steady her. The machine the boy had brought was rather fascinating. I asked if it recorded. He said no, but it seemed the sort of thing that ought to." "And you heard Dr. Harcote's voice?" Purbright asked. "Oh, perfectly," she said, her gaze steady. "Lionel had a way of speaking that cut through everything. I dare say it cut through the grave, too, if one wished to be fanciful." Love frowned. "Did you find it unsettling, madam?" She smiled. Number quite the reverse. It seemed rather like him to interrupt. He disliked being left out of civic occasions. She sipped her tea, a gesture of complete control. "I should think it gave people a fright, but Lionel would have enjoyed that." When they left, Love muttered that she had sounded almost admiring. Purbright did not answer at once. He stopped outside the garden gate, watching the street with that detached calm that seemed to empty him of urgency. "Admiration," he said finally, "is sometimes the tidiest disguise for resentment. We shall see which it is." Back at the station, he reviewed the statements so far. Each had confirmed Harcote's voice without hesitation. Each had supplied detail enough to make invention unlikely. And yet, the words spoken had been generic, fragments of a consultation, remarks that could have been drawn from a tape or memory. Only the invocation of Miss Dean's name had made them immediate. That detail suggested intention, not accident. Toward evening, Purbright walked home through the market square. The shops were closing. Blinds came down like polite eyelids. People greeted him cautiously, aware that his presence often meant the town was temporarily under examination. He stopped by the newsagent, where the evening edition of the Citizen displayed its headline, "The Doctor Speaks Again." Beneath it, a smaller line, "Residents recall voice at Hall." Purbright bought a copy and read the first paragraph, which had already embroidered fact with conjecture. He folded it away without annoyance. The town, he thought, was doing exactly what it always did, transforming mystery into entertainment. His task was to see which part of the entertainment would prove inadmissible when the truth finally asked to be let in. Later, in his office, he considered the next step. To assume the voice had been conjured electronically was reasonable. But why at that moment, in that place? And who had chosen Harcote as the ghost most worth reviving? He made a note. test possibility of recording through telephone coupler. Identify ownership of tapes. Confirm if Harcote's dictation machine missing reels. Then he wrote another line beneath it in his small, steady hand. Ask who profits when the dead continue to speak. The question sat on his desk, a patient companion, as the town outside darkened into silence. The following morning began with a thin drizzle that turned the high street into a mirror for umbrellas. Inspector Purbright arrived at the station in no particular hurry, for he believed haste to be more disturbing to evidence than rain ever was. Sergeant Love, however, was already at his desk with a look of earnest anticipation that suggested he had been storing questions overnight. "They've been talking again, sir," Love said as Purbright entered. "The whole thing's taken a new turn. Someone swears they heard Harcote's voice yesterday evening, this time at the post office." Purbright took off his hat and placed it on the rack with the same gravity with which he might set down a verdict. "Ah," he said, "the dead doctor becomes restless. Did the voice purchase stamps?" Love flushed slightly but persisted. "Miss Halberd, the postmistress, says the exchange line gave a sort of cough and then she heard him clear as anything. Just a few words, mind. She insists it wasn't imagination." Purbright sat and folded his hands on the desk. "Miss Halberd has never been accused of imagination. That in itself makes the matter interesting. We shall call upon her this morning. But first, tell me what you have learned of Harcote's dictation tapes." Love produced a notebook. I went through his desk with Miss Dean's permission. There were 4 reels in all, 3 marked with months and lists of prescriptions, 1 blank. At least, labeled blank. When I tried it on the machine, it carried a short passage, Harcote correcting a note for a fee. Nothing about Stokes or the sneezing dog. "Curious," Purbright murmured. "A blank tape that proves not to be blank at all. I should think that is a clue left by a man who disliked waste, or by someone who preferred to reuse without erasing. In either case, it tells us there is a store of his voice that could be employed by others. We must discover where those spools wander once his desk is closed." By 10 o'clock, they were at the post office. Miss Halberd, a tall woman whose spectacles gave her the air of a benevolent crow, received them in the back room where telegram forms slumbered in dusty piles. She explained without drama what had happened. "It was 5:30, she said, "just as I was preparing to close the accounts. I had the receiver off the hook, listening for the final balances, when I heard Dr. Harcote quite distinctly. He said, 'Yes, Tuesday will do, 10:30, not Stokes, the other one.'" The line then returned to its usual rustle. Love's pencil paused. "The same words, more or less, as at the hall." "Yes," Miss Halberd replied, "only shorter. I knew the doctor well. He paid his bills on Fridays, usually in small notes. His voice was not one that allowed for doubt. He was there, gentlemen. Or something of him was." Purbright asked to examine the lines. She led them to the small exchange room, its panel of plugs and wires looking like an elderly musical instrument. Nothing appeared disturbed. Still, Purbright asked quietly whether anyone else had been present. "Only Mrs. Clegg," Miss Halberd admitted. "She brought in a parcel, stood talking while I finished my entry. She seemed distracted, kept watching the telephone as if it might turn into a cat." Outside, Love gave voice to his suspicion. "So the same words, sir, repeated. If it's a tape, someone is letting it loose on the lines again and again." Purbright nodded, stepping carefully across the wet pavement. "That, or someone is reminding us of Lionel Harcote's habits with a persistence that will not be ignored. Repetition is never careless. It is always addressed to an audience. The question is, what audience?" They decided to speak next with Mrs. Clegg, who lived above the ironmonger's with a husband famous for his pickled onions and his inability to refuse credit. Mrs. Clegg received them in a parlor dense with doilies, her hands occupied by knitting that seemed more punishment than hobby. "Oh yes," she said when asked. "I was there at the post office. I heard something, though I pretended not to." The doctor was never a man I wished to encourage. He was too free with his opinions about digestion. But he spoke, yes, as if dictating. Miss Halberd looked as if she'd swallowed a hymn. I told myself it was a fault in the wires, but faults don't usually remember patients' names, do they? "Did you repeat this to anyone afterwards?" Purbright asked. "Only Councillor Dibb," she admitted primly. "One must tell her such things. Otherwise, she collects them like a debt." Love, writing, asked, "Do you know Mrs. Gray?" Mrs. Clegg's knitting paused. "Elspeth's cousin, a composed woman. Too composed. She does not gossip, which is in itself suspicious. Why do you ask?" Purbright smiled faintly. "Because she too has taken an interest in Lionel's voice. I wonder whether she has expressed any opinions to you." "She once told me," Mrs. Clegg said slowly, "that Flaxborough has a poor memory, that people here forget what men were like once they are buried. She said it would be a service if some could be reminded. I did not press her meaning. I seldom press women who smile when they say such things." As they left, Love remarked, "It's all drifting back to Mrs. Gray, sir. She's everywhere in this." Purbright gave a small nod. "She is, yet she remains curiously absent in detail. That is often the sign of a hand that guides but does not push. We must contrive to see her again, but not yet. Better to let her think her influence is invisible." Back at the station, a constable reported that Councillor Dibb had left a message requesting an interview. Purbright decided to oblige at once, for Dora Dibb's sense of timing was often the best barometer of town anxiety. She arrived in her customary brisk attire, an umbrella as stiff as her opinions. "Inspector," she began, before she had quite sat down, "the town is unsettled. Voices in halls, voices in the post office. Next we shall hear him reading prayers in church. I consider it damaging to civic discipline. Something must be done, and visibly, before gossip takes root like bindweed." Purbright regarded her evenly. "You wish us to explain the inexplicable, Councillor?" "I wish," she said with measured firmness, "that you establish responsibility. Someone is tampering with lines. It is not the supernatural I fear. It is mischief. And mischief in Flaxborough is more dangerous than murder. It lingers." She went on to hint, with a look that was both stern and discreet, that Mrs. Harcote might have reasons for wanting her husband's presence to linger, particularly in financial matters. Insurance, she suggested, could be persuasive company for the imagination. Purbright listened politely, made a note he did not intend to use, and allowed her to leave feeling useful. When the office was quiet again, Love asked cautiously, "Do you think she could be right, sir? That Mrs. Harcote might have arranged it?" Purbright lifted his gaze toward the window, where the drizzle blurred the rooftops into one long sigh. "Mrs. Harcote is careful, but not foolish. A woman who truly wished her husband's voice to live again would not choose the Memorial Hall or the post office as stages. No, Love, the theatre is someone else's. She remains an unwilling audience." They ended the day with a short walk through Queen Street, pausing outside the shuttered surgery. The square brass plate was gone entirely now, leaving only the faint imprint of its presence. Purbright stood a moment in the damp evening air, then spoke with his customary mildness. "Voices," he said, "are curious things. They outlast reputations, outlast even affection. We are being invited to believe that Harcote's voice is still among us, but voices are rarely idle. They are made to persuade. We must ask ourselves, what is it that someone wishes Flaxborough to be persuaded of?" Love, who was not given to philosophy, nevertheless understood the weight of the question. He said nothing more, and together they walked back toward the station, the sound of their steps mingling with the muted stir of a town that was learning, uneasily, to listen for the dead. By the next morning, the drizzle had lifted, leaving the market square with the look of a freshly washed plate, dull, streaked, and honest. The town's people carried on as though nothing more unusual than damp weather had occurred, yet their eyes seemed to glance sideways at the telephones in shop fronts, as if each might begin speaking on its own. Purbright arrived at the station to find Sergeant Love already bent over a pile of notes that looked alarmingly industrious. "Morning, sir," Love said, with the eager air of someone who hopes his energy will be contagious. "We've had more reports, nothing dramatic, just mutterings that the late Dr. Harcote's voice was overheard again. One claim from a fishmonger who swears it came through his scales electric bell. Another from a fellow at the garage who says the radio was repeating a prescription." Purbright hung his hat with his usual calm. "The dead doctor seems to be growing adventurous. Soon, no doubt, he will be booking railway tickets. Have you verified either of these testimonies?" Love colored faintly. "Not exactly. They sounded exaggerated. But people are getting restless. The Citizen has promised a special column." "That," said Purbright, seating himself with gentle finality, "is the most reliable symptom of a town turning nonsense into doctrine. When truth and invention have married, the Citizen prints the banns." Still, he leafed through the notes. The accounts had a sameness that troubled him. Harcote's clipped phrases, the correction about Stokes, the Tuesday appointment. Each version carried slight variations, but all circled the same words like moths about a lamp. It was not accident. It was rehearsal. At 11, Miss Dean arrived, looking unusually pale. She asked to see Purbright in private, and was ushered into his office with the courtesy of a confidant. "I've remembered something, Inspector," she said, seating herself neatly. "It may not matter, but it was the week before the funeral. Mrs. Gray came into the surgery to help with some papers. She asked me to leave her alone in the consulting room. When I returned, she was standing by the dictation machine with a reel in her hand. She said she was checking whether it worked. I thought nothing of it then." "Did you notice which reel?" Miss Dean shook her head. "It was one of the labeled ones, I think. She put it back when I came in." Purbright thanked her gravely. "It may matter, Miss Dean. Sometimes the smallest recollection can show us where an intention first placed its feet." After she had gone, Love burst in with more local chatter. Councillor Dibb was pressing for a formal inquiry into malicious telephony. The vicar had suggested a public prayer meeting, and Mrs. Clegg was telling neighbours that she expected the doctor to order her onions reduced. "Do you think Mrs. Gray's the hand behind it all, sir?" Love asked. "Think, Love. Number I observe. We must never spoil observation with thought too soon. But I incline to the belief that Mrs. Gray takes pleasure in arranging what other people remember. To what end, I have not yet been told." That afternoon they paid another visit to Queen Street, this time at Mrs. Harcote's request. She received them in a front parlour, heavy with curtains, her face pale but composed. "I asked you here," she began, "because people have been kind enough to bring me rumours, and I cannot tell whether kindness or cruelty drives them. Is it true, Inspector, that my husband's voice has been heard all over the town?" Purbright replied with measured civility. "It has been reported. The substance is not in question. The method is. We suspect a recording. Someone may have borrowed or duplicated the tapes from the surgery." Mrs. Harcote inclined her head slightly. "If so, then it is not mischief alone. Lionel had enemies, but none who would take this trouble. No, Inspector, this is the work of someone with a cause, and I should like to know what cause involves my husband's voice." Her poise was remarkable. Purbright studied her without seeming to. "Tell me, madam," he said gently, "did your cousin ever take a particular interest in Lionel's professional manner?" Her eyes moved to the mantelpiece where a photograph of Harcote presided in stiff dignity. Mrs. Gray admired him, but admiration can be another word for envy. She used to say that Lionel had mastered the town, that he could make people do what he wished with a few words. She envied that control. I always suspected she wanted a voice like his for herself. Purbright let the silence stretch, then asked, "Did you ever see her use the dictation machine?" She told me once that she had tried it in his absence. She liked the sound of authority coming out of a box. I laughed. Perhaps I should not have. The interview left them with more suspicion than certainty. On the way back to the station, Love voiced the thought that Mrs. Gray could easily have copied Harcote's tapes and replayed them through the telephone coupler at the hall. "But why, sir? What's in it for her? Just to make people talk?" Purbright gave him one of his thin smiles. "Talk is never just talk, Love. It is power distributed cheaply. In a town like ours, gossip is both parliament and pulpit. To command it is to command much. We shall watch Mrs. Gray and see what she intends to do with her orchestra of whispers." By evening, the Citizen had published its promised column under the headline, "His Voice Still Heard." The article, written by Mr. Reps with his usual blend of skepticism and relish, listed 3 supposed incidents and concluded with the suggestion that Flaxborough may be privileged with a haunting of civic distinction. Purbright read it at his desk and allowed himself a sigh, not of frustration, but of recognition. The town had accepted the voice as entertainment. That made it harder to dislodge. That night, as he walked home past the silent Memorial Hall, he paused to look at the telephone line drooping between poles. It carried not just voices, he reflected, but reputations, grudges, and, apparently, memories of the dead. Someone was feeding the line with Harcote's ghost, and until he knew why, he would let the town's gossip ferment. For gossip, like cider, revealed its true strength only after time. When he resumed his walk, the inspector's expression was not stern nor even thoughtful. It was the faint, unreadable smile of a man who knew that patience, too, could be a kind of trap. The following morning dawned sharp and clear, as if the drizzle of the previous days had washed the air of its doubts. In Flaxborough, however, clarity was seldom a quality of conversation. The market square hummed with undertones. Women at the greengrocer's paused over cauliflowers to repeat the doctor's phrases. Clerks in the town hall murmured about the post office incident, and even the milkman informed his customers that Harcote had once told him off for overfilling a bottle, and did so in precisely that same voice. The town was convinced it had been summoned by the dead. Purbright, however, was not convinced. He sat in his office with the dictation machine open before him, the spools slowly turning, while Sergeant Love dutifully copied phrases into a notebook. "Not Stokes, the other one," Love read aloud. "There it is again. The same words as at the hall, and as Miss Halbert heard at the post office." Purbright let the tape play on, the hiss and clicks filling the silence. Harcote's voice emerged, brusque, tidy, exact. There was no mystery in it, only the sound of habit, an efficiency sharpened by impatience. "Do you notice, Love," Purbright asked mildly, "that the doctor was not in the habit of making poetry? His phrases are functional. A man who corrected his own notes aloud because he feared clerical error, and yet someone has decided that this function is more persuasive than any invention. Why?" Love frowned over the words. "It unsettles people, sir. Makes them wonder what business of theirs isn't finished. If you hear the dead man speaking, you ask what he still wants." "Precisely." Purbright stopped the reel and leaned back. "And if you want a town to remember certain matters, you need only give them his voice at intervals, until they are persuaded the past has not been buried." Their reflections were interrupted by the arrival of Councillor Dora Dibb, who entered the station without waiting to be announced, her umbrella pointed like a spear. "Inspector, it is intolerable," she declared, planting herself in the chair opposite. "Now the post office has been invaded. Next it will be the library, then the cemetery gates. I shall be obliged to convene a public meeting." "I should advise against that, Councillor," Purbright said with his customary calm. "Public meetings tend to produce more ghosts than they exorcise." Then at least make it known that the police are investigating, she insisted. The town needs a statement. We cannot be left to whisper like washerwomen. Purbright promised to issue a carefully worded assurance, and Councillor Dibb departed, mollified, though clearly prepared to take credit for any resolution. Love looked after her gloomily. She won't rest until she's found a culprit herself, he muttered. Perhaps, said Purbright, she will save us the trouble. Gossip, when properly guided, can do half our work. The trick is to ensure it arrives at the right house. Later that day, they paid a call on Mrs. Gray. She received them in her polished sitting room, composed as ever, her eyes bright with a confidence that hinted at enjoyment. "You are most welcome, Inspector," she said smoothly. "I suppose you have come about these little disturbances?" Poor Lionel. It seems he has become more talkative since death than he ever was alive. "Have you yourself heard his voice?" Purbright asked. She allowed herself a small smile. "At the hall, of course. Clear as a bell. It did not surprise me. Lionel always was one to make himself heard. Did it comfort you?" Her eyes flickered, just for a second. "Comfort? I would not say that. Amusement, perhaps. The town is such a dull place. One must be grateful for a touch of drama." Purbright's gaze remained steady. "Did you ever use his dictation machine, Mrs. Gray?" She laughed softly. "Oh, Inspector, I see you have been talking to Elspeth. Yes, I tried it once or twice. Who could resist? To hear one's own words replayed, imbued with authority, it is a curious sensation. But that was long ago. I assure you, I have no machine hidden in my cupboard." He did not press further. Instead, he asked about her presence at the hall on the morning of the incident. She admitted freely that she had stood near the telephone, watching the contraption with interest. "I asked the boy if it could make copies," she said. "He told me it merely amplified. But really, Inspector, one cannot help but wonder what marvelous things can be done with machines these days." When they left, Love looked troubled. "She's not even pretending innocence, sir. She's practically daring us to accuse her." "Yes," Purbright agreed, "that is what makes her interesting. Guilt usually hides, vanity displays itself. We must determine which of the two Mrs. Gray is practicing." That evening, Purbright visited the Peacock and Teasel alone. The snug was crowded, the air thick with theories. Mr. Mallaby was expounding on how telephone lines could act as conduits for souls. Mr. Reps was scribbling notes, already drafting tomorrow's sensational column. And Mrs. Clegg, seated with her knitting like a prophetess, announced to all within earshot that she expected Dr. Harcote to order her husband's onions condemned. Purbright listened, sipping his mild ale, until the conversation shifted to insurance. Someone whispered that Mrs. Harcote might benefit handsomely if her husband's name continued to be invoked, even after death. Others speculated that Lionel himself had arranged for tapes to be played posthumously as a final act of mischief. The town, it seemed, was more entertained than frightened. On his way back, Purbright allowed himself a private reflection. The repetition of the doctor's words was no accident. Whoever had loosed his voice onto the town had chosen phrases of routine, of appointments and patience, rather than confidences or revelations. That was deliberate. The point was not to shock with secrets, but to unsettle with the ordinary words from an extraordinary source. At the station the next morning, Love reported that another incident had occurred. This time at the telephone kiosk near the railway station. A porter claimed to have lifted the receiver and heard Harcote dictating as before. Purbright nodded gravely. Then the circle widens. A hall, a post office, now a public kiosk, each more communal than the last. Whoever is behind this wishes not to confide, but to broadcast. He paced slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. It is like the planting of rumors in soil that has already been watered. First a select audience at the hall, then officials at the post office, now strangers at the station. The town itself is being taught to hear him. Love asked, Do you think Mrs. Gray is behind it? Purbright paused. I think Mrs. Gray enjoys the spectacle. But enjoyment is not always authorship. There may be another hand, one who prefers to remain quite hidden, while Mrs. Gray distracts us with her candid poise. We must be careful not to mistake performance for command. That day, he arranged for the police exchange operator to monitor calls for unusual interference. He also asked Miss Dean to review all remaining tapes in Harcote's desk. The young woman returned that afternoon with news. One reel was missing. It was labeled April, she said. I am certain it was there last week. Now it has gone. Purbright received the information with quiet satisfaction. A missing month, he murmured. And what, I wonder, did April contain that someone wishes us all to remember? That evening, as the town closed its shutters and the lamps glowed against the cobbles, Purbright sat at his desk and allowed the fragments to align themselves in his mind. The voice of a dead man, repeated with precision. A cousin who admired authority to the point of envy. A widow who preferred silence to memory. A missing tape. Somewhere between them lay the truth. He picked up his pen and wrote in his neat, patient hand, Tomorrow, invite Mrs. Gray to the station. Let her hear Harcote's voice played back. Not from the telephone, but from her own lips. Then watch whether she listens like an admirer or like a culprit. The inspector set down the pen, extinguished his lamp, and allowed the town's quiet to enfold him. Flaxborough, he knew, was listening for the dead. He, however, was listening for the living. The summons to Mrs. Gray was phrased with the careful neutrality of official correspondence, an invitation to call at the police station and assist with clarifying certain matters. No accusation, no suggestion of impropriety, merely the polite obligation of a citizen. Nevertheless, when she arrived the following morning, she carried herself with the wary brightness of one who has anticipated suspicion and prepared her armor of composure. She was shown into the same interview room where Miss Dean had sat days before. The dictation machine was on the table, its spool already threaded, the small speaker resting like a patient listener. Purbright received her with a civility that could have been mistaken for indifference. Sergeant Love busied himself with paper at the corner, his earnest features a picture of clumsy transparency. Mrs. Gray, Purbright began gently, we are grateful you agreed to help us. As you know, there have been reports of Dr. Harcote's voice being heard in several places around town. Understandably, people are unsettled. You were present at the Memorial Hall when one such instance occurred. May I ask what you thought? She gave a faint laugh, not entirely humorless. I thought the town had finally been given something to talk about besides marrows and drains. It was Lionel's voice, of course. No one who knew him could mistake it. As to how it happened, well, Inspector, surely that is your puzzle, not mine. Purbright inclined his head. Indeed. Yet puzzles sometimes require the cooperation of spectators. You see, what interests me most is not merely that the voice was heard, but which phrases were chosen. He gestured toward the machine. With your permission, I should like to play a portion of Dr. Harcote's recordings. I should be grateful for your impressions. She gave a small shrug of consent. The tape rolled, and Harcote's voice emerged, crisp and peremptory. Miss Dean, take the name. Not Stokes. The other one. 10:30. The dog sneezes. The words filled the room with their peculiar mixture of banality and authority. Mrs. Gray's smile did not falter, but her eyes flicked briefly downward, as though following a thought she preferred not to share. Yes, she said after a moment. That is what we all heard. The same clipped certainty. I cannot explain it. But then, does one ever explain the persistence of memory? Love leaned forward, almost eagerly. You'd say it was exactly the same. Not just similar. Exactly, she answered firmly. Lionel never wasted words. He had his set phrases like tools. They've lingered. Purbright stopped the machine and folded his hands. "You are right, Mrs. Gray. Phrases linger. They can be repeated by others, even after the speaker is gone. You yourself remarked, I believe, that the dictation machine gave a curious sense of authority when you tried it." Her gaze sharpened. "I told you that only in jest." "Jests," said Purbright mildly, "are often rehearsals of what we cannot yet admit." There was a silence, filled only by the faint tick of the clock on the wall. Mrs. Gray composed herself once more, her voice smooth. "Inspector, if you think I have been carrying around reels of tape to startle the town, you overestimate both my dexterity and my patience. I have better amusements." Purbright did not contradict her. He simply nodded, made a note, and dismissed her with a politeness so careful it was almost cold. She left with a composed smile, though as the door closed, there was the slightest tightening about her mouth, like a stitch pulled too hard. When she had gone, Love exclaimed, "She knows more than she'll say, sir. Did you see her face when the tape played?" She recognized something. Purbright poured himself a cup of lukewarm tea. She recognized herself, Love. People often do when confronted with the authority they admire. Whether she also recognized her own hand in these disturbances remains to be discovered. The day did not end there. In the afternoon, a call came from the railway station. Another appearance of Harcote's voice had been reported, this time by a porter who had been telephoning the goods office. The words, once again, were near identical. Purbright and Love went at once. The porter, a thin man with the look of someone perpetually surprised by his own employment, swore he had heard the doctor clearly. "Said about Tuesday, 10:30, same as everyone else. I near dropped the receiver." "Did anyone else hear it?" Purbright asked. "Mrs. Carter, sir. She was waiting for a parcel. She went pale as milk." Purbright turned to Love. "We shall speak with Mrs. Carter." Mrs. Carter proved to be a stout, practical woman with no taste for embellishment. "It was him, right enough," she confirmed. "Lionel Harcote. Sounded just as he used to when telling you not to waste his time. I didn't stay to hear more. I went out and crossed myself, though I'm not in the habit." Back at the station, Love fretted. "It's spreading, sir. First the hall, then the post office, now the station. If it happens again, the whole town will be in a state." "Not quite," Purbright said, his tone thoughtful. "The whole town will be in a mood. That is not the same as a state. Moods are easier to direct than states. The repetition of identical phrases suggests not random haunting, but a campaign. Someone wishes to remind us, persistently, of appointments not kept and instructions given. We must ask, for whose benefit?" Love suggested again that Mrs. Harcote might have something to gain. Insurance, sympathy, perhaps influence. Purbright shook his head. "Number, she desires peace, not theatre. Her grief is tidy. She would not invite her husband's voice back to lecture the town." Then Mrs. Gray. "Perhaps," Purbright said, "but if she is the hand, she's not the mind. Vanity craves admiration. This is persuasion. We must discover whose cause is being served." That evening, Purbright allowed himself a walk along Queen Street. He paused before the shuttered surgery, its windows blind, the brass plate removed. He thought of the missing April reel, the exact repetition of phrases and the peculiar eagerness with which the town embraced the notion of the dead dictating to the living. A cat padded along the pavement, pausing to glance up at him with the indifferent curiosity of its kind. Purbright smiled faintly, then turned back toward the station. Later, as he wrote his notes, he added a line beneath the day's observations. "Who requires the dead man to be still issuing instructions?" And beneath that, another, smaller, not grief, but power. The town might be amused by its ghostly doctor, but Purbright knew amusement was often the thinnest cover for unease. Someone was feeding Flaxborough its own memories, served in Harcote's clipped tones. He intended to discover who and why, before the repetition turned into something the town could no longer laugh away. That night, as he extinguished the lamp and looked once more at the neat rows of his notes, Inspector Purbright considered that voices may linger, but they are always chosen. And it was the chooser, not the voice, that concerned him now. Inspector Purbright was not given to dreams, but that night his sleep took on a kind of busy patience, as though his subconscious had arranged its own filing system. He awoke with the phrase, "Not Stokes," the other one still echoing in his head, as if the dead doctor had been dictating in his sleep. Over breakfast he considered the peculiarity. Harcote's words were too banal for invention, yet too exact to be coincidence. Someone had lifted them whole and set them loose upon the town like fragments of an unfinished sermon. By 9 o'clock, Purbright was back at the station, greeted by Sergeant Love with an expression that suggested both fatigue and excitement. "It's happened again, sir," Love announced. This time at the town clerk's office. Mr. Sprott himself heard it. He was dictating a letter about drain repairs when the line crackled, and then Harcote's voice came on. Same words. Sprott nearly fell off his chair. Purbright accepted the news without change of expression. The doctor has become ambitious. He intrudes now upon bureaucracy. Love looked grim. People are beginning to say he's trying to finish unfinished business, that he won't rest until someone keeps an appointment. "Appointments are rarely kept in this town when the living make them," Purbright replied dryly. "I doubt the dead are. More efficient." Nevertheless, he agreed they should speak with Mr. Sprott. They found the town clerk at his desk, perspiring mildly despite the chill, his handkerchief employed more as reassurance than necessity. "It was Harcote," Sprott declared, mopping his brow. "I recognized that pedantic cough before every remark. He said, 'Not Stokes, the other one, 10:30 Tuesday.' Then the line cleared and I was left with the drain survey half finished. Do you wonder I'm shaken?" "Were you alone?" Purbright asked. "My secretary was present, but she fainted the moment she heard the voice. I cannot vouch for her testimony. She is inclined to hysteria." Purbright studied him a moment. "Mr. Sprott, has anyone had access to your office telephone in recent days?" "Councillor Dibb, of course. She supervises everything, and Mrs. Gray visited to deliver a paper concerning a bequest. She remarked on the telephone, called it the nervous system of the town. I thought it an odd phrase." "Indeed," Purbright said. "And what did you reply?" "That the nervous system seemed to be suffering from delirium." She laughed. Back at the station, Love was indignant. "She's behind it, sir. Mrs. Gray again, always where she shouldn't be, always commenting on telephones. It's too much of a pattern." "Patterns, Love," Purbright said quietly, "are the most convenient decorations of coincidence. We must ask not only whether she could, but why she should. Vanity alone does not compel one to rouse the dead." Love persisted. "But why the same words, sir? Why not something new?" Purbright poured tea with the calmness of a man watering plants. "Because repetition is persuasive. Once heard, twice doubted, thrice remembered. By the fourth telling, it becomes fact, and fact, once accepted, can be put to work." That afternoon they called at Mrs. Harcote's house once more. She received them in her sitting room, where the curtains were drawn though the day was bright. Her face was pale, and her voice low but steady. "Inspector," she said, "I cannot endure much more of this. Neighbors cross the street when they see me. Children whisper that my husband is listening at the walls. If this continues, I shall be forced to leave Flaxborough." Purbright listened gravely. "Do you know, Mrs. Harcote, whether your husband kept particular notes in April? A month's reel is missing from his dictation machine." She looked startled. April? That was when Edwin Stokes came often. He was unwell, nervous, fearful about his nephew's debts. Lionel saw him twice a week, and there was talk of a prescription he ought not to have had. But I never knew details. "Did anyone outside the surgery know of these visits?" She hesitated. "Mrs. Gray. She often called on me. She noticed Edwin arriving. She asked questions, more than was polite. I told her nothing, but she was interested. She said Flaxborough forgets its scandals too quickly. When they left, Love was triumphant. "There you are, sir. Mrs. Gray again, and this time with motive. If Stokes was mixed in something questionable and Gray knew, perhaps she wanted the doctor's voice to remind the town." Purbright walked slowly along the pavement, his eyes on the cobblestones. Perhaps. Yet why use Harcote's voice and not her own? Why dress suspicion in the tones of authority rather than speak openly? That is the heart of the matter, Love. Someone believes Lionel Harcote's voice carries weight that no living tongue possesses. That evening, in the snug of the Peacock and Teasel, Purbright listened to the town's verdict. The men there were certain that Edwin Stokes must have reason to tremble, for everyone recalled his nervous ways and his nephew's dubious reputation. Mrs. Clegg knitted fiercely, declaring that Harcote had once refused Edwin a bottle of tonic, and that such refusals usually meant something shameful. Mr. Reps of the Citizen had already written a headline in his notebook. "The doctor names his patients from the grave." Purbright sipped his ale and allowed the gossip to settle like silt. When he finally rose to go, he remarked only that vegetables, unlike men, kept their secrets better. It was the kind of remark that left the snug puzzled and slightly flattered. Back at his office, he set down a fresh note. Voice used to remind town of Edwin Stokes. Motive may lie in April consultations. Who benefits if Stokes is discredited? He underlined the last sentence and leaned back, watching the words as though they might confess. Love came in, hesitant. "Sir, if this keeps on, there'll be panic. The town can tolerate one ghost, but not a haunting campaign. What do you mean to do?" Purbright smiled faintly. "Tomorrow we shall pay Mr. Edwin Stokes a visit. If his nerves are truly unsettled, perhaps the dead doctor's voice has already been whispering to him without the need of telephones, and if not, we shall see whether guilt speaks more clearly than any machine." The sergeant looked half relieved, half apprehensive. Purbright extinguished his lamp and stood, his figure outlined against the dim window. "Remember, Love," he said softly, "it is not the dead who trouble us. It is the living who find in the dead a voice more useful than their own. Let us see whose lips are moving behind Lionel Harcote's ghost." And with that, the inspector left the station, walking home through streets that seemed to lean inward as though listening. Flaxborough, after all, had begun to expect its doctor's voice at every corner. Purbright alone kept his ears tuned to the silence in between. The following day was raw with wind, the sort that persuaded shopkeepers to slam doors against it while claiming it was the draught they feared. Inspector Purbright, however, enjoyed such weather. He felt it kept the town from indulging itself too openly in talk. Even so, when he and Sergeant Love set out for Edwin Stokes's small terraced house on Netherby Lane, he knew they would find the air inside heavy with speculation, for nervous men often perfume their parlours with half-truths. Stokes received them with the unease of one who regards callers as creditors by default. He was a thin, sallow man whose hands seemed always to be trying to wring themselves free. The parlour was stifling with the smell of coal gas that had not yet caught flame. "You'll have heard, Inspector," Stokes began at once. "All this nonsense about Harcote speaking again. I want no part of it. I never liked the man in life, and I'll not have him in death." "Nevertheless," Purbright said kindly, "his voice seems fond of repeating your name, or rather, not your name, but the careful instruction, 'not Stokes.' That must strike you as curious." Stokes paled, his fingers twisted at the arm of his chair. "People repeat what they like. Harcote had dozens of patients. Why must they say it points to me?" "Because," Purbright replied, "he was heard to speak of the other one, which suggests there are two Stokeses, and because you were among his regular visitors in April, a month for which a dictation tape has inconveniently gone missing. We wish to know, Mr. Stokes, whether anything passed between you and the doctor then that might still interest others." The man's eyes darted, like fish trapped in shallow water. No, nothing. A tonic, perhaps. Some powders. He thought I worried too much. That was all. Love, who had less patience for evasion, pressed him. People say your nephew's debts were troubling you, that Harcote refused to help. Stokes's face tightened. My nephew is a fool with cards. Yes, I sought advice. No, the doctor gave none. He said I ought to keep my purse shut and my mouth tighter. He had no sympathy. Did he supply you with any medicine? Purbright asked. Valerian drops, Stokes muttered, for sleep. But he charged more than they were worth. I told him so. He laughed. Purbright watched him a long moment. And what would you think, Mr. Stokes, if his voice were to continue repeating your name? Or rather, to deny it? Stokes shuddered. I would think someone wishes to ruin me, and they'll succeed. Already neighbors cross the road, already men at the Peacock nod and whisper. Soon the bank will hear of it, and then where shall I be? Perhaps, Purbright said gently, exactly where someone intends you to be. They left him trembling in his chair, the gas fire still unlit, his figure shrinking into the gloom of his own house. Love looked back as they walked away. He's hiding something, sir. No man shakes like that for nothing. Indeed, Purbright said. But shaking is not always proof of guilt. Sometimes it is simply proof of being chosen as a target. The more interesting question is, who chose him? That afternoon, Purbright received a visit from Mr. Reps, the citizen reporter. The man looked smug, his notebook already fat with scribbles. Inspector, he said with mock deference, the town demands answers. I have it on good authority that Dr. Harcote left instructions in April concerning a patient whose name began with S. Naturally, the public has a right to know whether these instructions are the very ones we now hear repeated. Purbright regarded him mildly. The public, Mr. Reps, has many rights. Among them is the right not to be frightened unnecessarily. I advise you to exercise that one for a change. Reps smirked. But fright sells papers. And besides, Inspector, isn't it possible the doctor meant to expose something before he died, and that his voice is merely keeping the appointment? Possible, Purbright said, but not probable. Good day, Mr. Reps. After the journalist had gone, Love asked, Do you think he knows more than he lets on? Reps, Purbright smiled faintly. He knows less than he prints. But he has the instinct of a scavenger. He circles where there is carrion. That tells us our quarry lies close. The next evening brought another development. Miss Dean, pale but composed, arrived at the station carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. I found this, she said, hidden behind the surgery filing cabinet. It must have fallen. It is the April reel. Purbright unwrapped it carefully. The spool bore Harcote's thin handwriting. April, Stokes, Pym, fees. They threaded it onto the machine. The tape played with its usual hiss. Then Harcote's voice emerged, firm, dismissive, brisk. Not Stokes, the other one. 10:30. Miss Dean, take the note. Pym's dog again, sneezes worse. Fees overdue? Remind him. Not Stokes. The other, the words repeated, slightly varied as if the doctor had dictated while flicking through papers. Then silence. Love whistled softly. There it is, exactly as the town's been hearing it. So it is a tape. Someone's been replaying this reel through telephones. Purbright nodded, his expression unreadable. Yes, and someone placed it where Miss Dean might eventually find it, ensuring we had the evidence to believe what the town already believes. Then it was Mrs. Gray, Love exclaimed. She handled the tapes. She had access. She must have copied it and fed it through the coupler. Perhaps, Purbright said quietly. Yet copying a voice is not the same as choosing the moment to release it. Consider the stage, Love. The memorial hall, the post office, the station, the town clerk's desk. Each a place where repetition becomes rumor and rumor becomes record. Whoever planned this knew exactly where a voice would echo loudest. Love frowned. But why target Stokes? Why not some grand scandal? Purbright leaned back, steepling his fingers. Because Stokes is timid, vulnerable, easily suspected. His weakness makes him ideal. To whisper against him requires little effort. To see him collapse requires less. A larger scandal would provoke resistance. A small one grows unchecked, like mold on bread. That night, Purbright returned home with the April reel in his pocket. He sat at his small writing table, the lamp glowing softly, and wrote a careful list. Who benefits if Edwin Stokes is discredited? Who has access to tapes and telephones? Who has motive to persuade the town that Harcote is still correcting errors? He paused, then added a final line. Who delights in the theatre of repetition? The answer, he suspected, was not singular. Mrs. Gray admired authority, yes. Reps profited from gossip. Councillor Dibb thrived on disorder. Even Mrs. Clegg, in her way, enjoyed the thrill of scandal. But one among them had arranged the machinery. As he extinguished the lamp, Purbright thought of Harcote himself, brisk, impatient, intolerant of folly. If the doctor could see Flaxborough now, he would have scolded it for its credulity. Yet perhaps, Purbright reflected, that was the true brilliance of the scheme. The town had been given not a secret, but a scolding. And people remembered scoldings long after they forgot kindness. Tomorrow, he resolved, he would invite Mrs. Gray once more, not to accuse her, but to let her hear the April reel in full. Then he would watch not her ears, but her eyes. For it is the eyes, Purbright knew, that betray whether one is listening as an audience or as an author. And outside, the wind rattled the telegraph wires, so that for a moment the town itself seemed to hum with voices waiting to be spoken. The following morning, Purbright requested that Mrs. Gray attend the station once more. The invitation was drafted with the same disarming politeness as before. Your assistance may prove invaluable, and delivered by Constable Malley, who had a knack for sounding apologetic even when issuing summonses. Mrs. Gray arrived at 10:30, composed as always, dressed in a dark jacket that looked as if it had been ironed by conscience. She smiled faintly when shown again into the interview room, but her eyes flicked toward the dictation machine waiting on the table. "You mean to play me Lionel's voice again, Inspector?" she asked. "The town will soon expect matinees." Purbright inclined his head. "We have recovered the April reel. I thought you might assist us by listening to it. Your impressions would be helpful." Love threaded the spool, his movements less deft than Miss Dean's had been, but adequate. The machine whirred to life, the hiss filled the room, and then came Harcote's clipped tones. "Not Stokes." The other one. 10:30. Pym's dog. Sneezes again. "Fees overdue." Not Stokes. The other, the words repeated, fading into silence. Mrs. Gray listened without visible reaction, save for the faint tightening of her fingers on her handbag. When the tape stopped, she said evenly, "Yes." That is what we heard at the hall, at the post, office, everywhere. A strange immortality for Lionel. "Indeed," Purbright said mildly. "Immortality rarely comes so cheaply." She looked at him sharply. "You think I arranged this? Really, Inspector, must we waste one another's time?" Purbright poured tea into 2 cups, offering her one with quiet courtesy. "Waste is a matter of perspective, Mrs. Gray. Some would say repetition itself is wasteful, yet it is also the foundation of memory. Tell me, why should the town be reminded of Edwin Stokes in particular?" She gave a small laugh, a little too crisp. "Because Edwin is weak, and weak men always attract blame. Lionel despised him. Perhaps he still does." "Despised," Purbright repeated gently. "That is a strong word for a physician's duty." "Lionel had little patience for duty," she replied, a flicker of bitterness in her tone. "He enjoyed power, Inspector. The power to dismiss, to command. He thought it a kindness to say "not Stokes" rather than accuse him directly. Even now, from the grave, he dictates. Purbright regarded her steadily. "And you, Mrs. Gray, do you enjoy repeating his dictation for him?" For the first time, her composure faltered. A flush rose to her cheeks. She stood abruptly, placing her cup down with deliberate care. "I shall not sit here to be accused by innuendo. If you have evidence, present it. If not, I have no further role to play in your séance." Purbright rose as well, bowing slightly. "As you wish, madam. But remember, ghosts seldom appear without an audience. Someone must always open the door." She swept out with dignity and tact, but her anger lingered like perfume. Love exhaled heavily. "She's rattled, sir. You had her cornered." Purbright shook his head. "Not cornered, prodded. A rattled cage may yet reveal the shape of the bird inside. But we must not mistake temper for guilt." That afternoon, Purbright and Love walked to the chemist's shop, a narrow establishment where bottles glowed like obedient jewels. The chemist, Mr. Laker, greeted them with solemn respect. "You'll be wanting to know about April," he said at once, as though the month itself had been indicted. "Yes, doctor." Harcote prescribed valerian for Mr. Edwin Stokes, and yes, he charged the fellow, though not more than usual. "I settled accounts after the funeral. Everything neat." "Did Stokes ever ask for more than valerian?" Purbright asked. The chemist hesitated. "Once, yes. He hinted at something stronger, barbiturates. The doctor refused. Said Stokes was too fond of excuses already. I heard Lionel raise his voice. It was rare for him to argue openly. Would others have known of this?" "Only Miss Dean," Mr. Laker said. "And perhaps Mrs. Gray. She seemed to know everything." "Back at the station," Love said. "So Stokes wanted drugs he couldn't have. Harcote refused. Maybe Stokes resented him enough to tamper with the tapes himself." "Possible," Purbright murmured, "but not probable. Stokes lacks the daring. His resentment is inward, not outward. He trembles under blame. He does not create it." Evening fell, and Purbright allowed himself a solitary walk to the memorial hall. The building was locked, its windows reflecting the lamplight like weary eyes. He stood a moment, listening to the faint hum of the wires above. The town lay quiet, but he could almost sense its anticipation, as though Flaxborough were leaning in, eager for the doctor's voice to command it once more. The next day brought fresh unease. Councillor Dibb telephoned the station in high indignation. "Inspector," she announced, "I've just been informed that Mr. Stokes is refusing to attend the drainage committee, citing distress caused by voices. I cannot have councillors excusing themselves on supernatural grounds. Something must be done." Purbright thanked her with unshakable politeness and hung up. Love muttered, "If Stokes collapses completely, the town will take it as proof he's guilty of something." "Which," Purbright said, "may be precisely what our unseen impresario intends." Later that morning they visited Stokes again. He looked worse than before, his eyes hollow, his manner furtive. "I can't stand it," he whispered. "Everywhere I go, people murmur, 'Not Stokes,' as if the whole town has judged me. I tell you, Inspector, someone wants me ruined." "Who, Mr. Stokes?" Purbright asked gently. He shook his head helplessly. "I don't know, but Mrs. Gray visits my sister often. She asks questions, always about April, about the doctor's refusals. She says the town has a right to remember. What does that mean, Inspector? What right have they to hound me?" Purbright studied him a long moment, then rose. "Mr. Stokes, take care of yourself. Guilt may tremble, but so may innocence. Our task is to see which it is." On the walk back, Love muttered, "She's tightening the noose, sir." Gray again. It has to be her. Purbright's eyes narrowed against the pale sky. It may be, or she may simply be the most visible shadow. "We must look behind her. Repetition is rarely the work of one person alone. There may be others, helpers or beneficiaries. That afternoon, Constable Malley reported that reps of the Citizen had been overheard boasting in the Peacock that he would soon reveal the truth about Edwin Stokes in print. Purbright smiled thinly. Reps has a gift for writing tomorrow's lies today, but he has no gift for invention. If he is boasting, it is because someone has fed him a script. By evening, the inspector felt the case had ripened. He took out his notebook, reviewed the pattern, and spoke aloud as if to the empty room. A voice repeated. A reel missing and found. A weak man singled out. A cousin who admires authority. A journalist who profits by scandal. Each thread by itself is slight, but woven together they form a fabric of persuasion. Someone is trying to condemn Stokes without ever naming him. The question remains, why? He closed the book and placed it carefully on the desk. Tomorrow, he resolved, he would test the town's appetite for its ghost. He would call together a few of the key players, Mrs. Gray, Mrs. Harcote, Stokes, and Councillor Dibb, and let Harcote's voice speak once more, in his presence, under his terms. If the guilty hand lay among them, it would tremble when the machine rolled. For Purbright knew that men and women may control their tongues, but never quite their eyes or their breathing. And a repeated voice, when played back under the gaze of authority, often reveals more than it conceals. The inspector extinguished his lamp, put on his hat, and stepped out into the evening streets. The wires above hummed faintly in the wind. To Flaxborough they promised another visitation from the dead. To Purbright they whispered of the living hand that had tuned them, and that, he knew, was the hand he must catch. The gathering Purbright convened was held, fittingly enough, in the Memorial Hall, that cavernous stage where the town's newest ghost had first chosen to appear. The inspector had arranged for the hall to be opened early in the evening, with chairs set in a modest semicircle, the telephone placed prominently on a table at the front, and the dictation machine beside it like an accomplice that had at last agreed to testify. When the small party arrived, Mrs. Gray, calm but watchful, Mrs. Harcote, pale and dignified, Councillor Dibb, crisp with indignation, and Edwin Stokes, trembling in his ill-fitting jacket, the hall seemed to inhale their presence. Sergeant Love busied himself with the apparatus, while Purbright, hands behind his back, welcomed them with a courtesy that was more judicial than hospitable. "You will wonder," he began mildly, "why I've asked you here. The town has been unsettled by certain echoes, voices that appear where they should not. I think it is time we listened together and perhaps learned more by our listening than by all the gossip that has filled the square." Mrs. Gray raised an eyebrow. "Inspector, if you mean to put us on trial with the machine as witness, I hope you have a better solicitor for it than for Mr. Stokes." Purbright allowed himself a faint smile. "Machines are only as guilty as the hands that guide them, Mrs. Gray. Let us see what they have been made to say." At his nod, Love threaded the April reel. The familiar hiss filled the hall, then Harcote's brusque tones rang out. "Not Stokes." The other one, 10:30, Tuesday, Pym's dog, sneezes again, fees overdue, not Stokes. The other, the words bounced from the bare walls. Stokes shuddered visibly, Mrs. Harcote closed her eyes, and Councillor Dibb pursed her lips as though the ghost had interrupted a meeting. Mrs. Gray sat perfectly still, but her gaze flickered, just once, toward Stokes. Purbright let the tape run its course, then clicked it off. The silence afterward was heavy with unsaid things. "You see," Purbright said gently, "the voice is real. The words were Harcote's, but they were recorded in April, in the course of his work. They do not belong to the present. Someone has taken these words, selected them, and chosen to make them reappear at the hall, at the post office, at the station, at the town clerk's desk, and always the same refrain. Not Stokes, the other one." Stokes's voice broke out, high and desperate. "I told you, Inspector, someone wants me ruined. Everyone hears it and thinks he meant to accuse me from the grave." Purbright turned to him, kindly but firm. "On the contrary, Mr. Stokes, the words acquit you. Harcote was distinguishing you from another, Neville Stokes, perhaps, or another patient entirely. The phrase, 'not Stokes,' is a dismissal, not a condemnation. Yet it has been repeated until the town now believes it a verdict, and that repetition has been no accident." All eyes shifted almost instinctively toward Mrs. Gray. She met their gaze without flinching. "Inspector, I admire your theatre. But do you mean to accuse me of lugging about reels and telephones? You flatter me." "I accuse no one yet," Purbright said softly. "But I invite you to reflect. You have admitted to handling the machine. You have spoken often of Lionel's power, how his voice compelled obedience. And you have told others, Mrs. Harcote, Mrs. Clegg, that the town forgets too quickly. What better way to remind them than to let his voice return?" Mrs. Harcote stirred, speaking for the first time. Her tone was calm, but the calm of exhaustion. "Eleanor," she said quietly, "did you do this? If you wished Lionel remembered, you might have chosen kinder words. Why torment Edwin?" Mrs. Gray's mask faltered for an instant, a flicker of something between pride and irritation. "Because," she said suddenly, her voice sharp, "Flaxborough deserves to remember the truth about its weaknesses. Stokes running to Lionel for sleeping drops, whispering about debts, hoping to be indulged. Half the town the same. And Lionel, oh, Lionel enjoyed it. He wielded his scorn like a surgeon's knife. I thought, why let that scorn die with him? Why not let the town hear it, again and again, until it admits what it is?" Stokes gasped, his hands clutching at his knees. "You've destroyed me. Everyone thinks I'm guilty of something vile. I'm not. I'm only weak." "Exactly," Mrs. Gray said coldly. "Weakness is guilt enough in a place like this." There was a silence, broken only by the faint tick of the hall's clock. Then Purbright spoke, his voice mild but edged with finality. "Mrs. Gray, your philosophy is ingenious, but the law does not concern itself with philosophy. You took possession of the tapes, you employed a coupler, and you fed Harcote's words into the town's wires. That is, mischief of a serious sort, bordering on persecution. You sought to manipulate reputation by lending the dead man's authority to your own disdain." Mrs. Gray rose, her face pale but composed. "If you wish to charge me, do so, but remember, Inspector, I've not forged a word. All I did was let Lionel speak again. If the town is shaken, it is by its own conscience." Councillor Dibb sniffed. "Nonsense. It is by your meddling, and you shall find that Flaxborough is not indulgent toward meddling, however clever." Purbright did not arrest Mrs. Gray that evening. Instead, he allowed her to leave under the watchful escort of Constable Malley. His reason was simple. To arrest her would be to make her scheme complete, to provide the scandal she desired. Better to let the town absorb the truth quietly, through channels less theatrical than hers. The following day, the Citizen published a sober account, stripped of its earlier sensationalism. Mr. Reps, chastened by a private word from Purbright, reported that the mysterious voices had been traced to misuse of recording apparatus, and that no supernatural phenomena were involved. The town, deprived of its ghost, sighed with disappointment, but soon found other subjects: council budgets, a forthcoming sale at Barker's. Stokes, though relieved, never wholly recovered his composure. He walked the streets as a man conscious of being remembered for weakness. Mrs. Harcote withdrew further into her quiet dignity, grateful at least that her husband's reputation had not been stained by scandal. Councillor Dibb congratulated herself loudly for having pressed the inspector to act. And Mrs. Gray, well, she resumed her visits, her smile undiminished, though the town looked at her now with a wary respect, as one who had shown how reputation could be broken with no more than a voice. In his office, Purbright completed the final note in his file. Case concluded? Voice explained. Mischief deliberate, not spectral. Town returns to routine, chastened but amused. He closed the file with the same mild patience with which he had opened it. Love, reading over his shoulder, asked, "Do you think she'll try again, sir?" Purbright sipped his tea before answering. "Mrs. Gray? Perhaps. But she has learned something too, that voices lose power when they are revealed as echoes. She will find another amusement, less mechanical." He leaned back, gazing out at the market square where people moved with their usual mixture of purpose and distraction. Flaxborough has had its haunting. It will talk of it for months, then file it away among the curiosities that make life bearable. And when the next oddity arises, and it will be greeted with the same blend of credulity and complaint. Love smiled, relieved. "So back to ordinary duties then, sir?" "Ordinary," Purbright said, his eyes twinkling faintly, "is never so simple in Flaxborough. But yes, back to paperwork, which is our true haunting." And with that, the inspector returned to his desk, his pen scratching softly, while outside the town exhaled and went on with its business as though nothing extraordinary had ever happened. Except that every now and then, when the telephone clicked or the radio crackled, people still paused for an instant, half expecting to hear a voice that was no longer there.